Good afternoon. This is Zigmund with the official Zigmund Reichenbach Show premiering today at 12 p.m. from 1. Excited to have on a new guest with us, the illustrious Mr. Christian Watson from Pensa Politics and his own live channel. Typically, he does that each day, and he is now a professional political commentator. Good to have you here, Christian. Hey, how's it going, buddy?
Going good. How's it going with you, Zigmund?
All right, man. Just looking forward to diving into a full slate of topics that we got today. For those who are new to the show, check out zigmundreichenbach.com and you will be able to follow right along with all the things that we plan to discuss here, right at the intersection of news, politics, and culture. The first thing we'll just kick it off with is this idea of progressive religion. In the first piece that I wrote this week, I discussed a piece called God Without Gods. And in that, I noted how many on the left still appear to have a religion, although they insist otherwise. One thing I missed on there is that I think that there's a fundamental difference between atheism and being irreligious. But I think Marx started us off down this path to having religions without God and having people worship things like the state, fairness, and equality. Right in the first paragraph, it says, Marx famously declared that religion is the opiate of the masses. And as a proud dealer of the communist religion, Marx would indeed know. As the messiah of the left, Marx created a new kind of religion that eliminated deities and replaced them with abstract ideas like utopia. So let's go from there, Christian. Do you think the left's problem with religion is causing social problems in the U.S., or do you think it's a good thing that they have sort of embraced this religion that doesn't acknowledge God?
Well, before I proceed, you can hear me fine, right? I'm coming through okay, right? All right, very good. So I have heard the term, not used, rather, I've heard the term religion used in the context of certain political ideas by a variety of thinkers. John McWhorter has this penchant for calling critical race theory and wokeism and critical justice all religion. And a lot of people on the right are increasingly growing to call various left-wing ideas, this consortium of various left-wing ideas, whether it's Marxism, whether it's egalitarianism, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's veganism, to all be religious or pseudo-religious. To me, stylistically, this seems like an epithet. And it may not be always meant as an epithet, but it certainly seems like an epithet. Because think about it, when you say something as a religion, that itself is not an argument, unless calling something a religion presupposes something. Because if you just say, well, environmentalism is a religion, okay, there are plenty of religions. What does that mean? But typically it's understood that when someone says, well, wokeism or environmentalism are religions, they are ideas that inspire this sort of servility that escapes the bounds of rational thinking. That's the presumption a lot of folks use. Sure. And I have a problem with that, because it presumes that religion itself escapes the bounds of rational thinking. Now, there could be a conversation about the various religious depictions of gods and deities or whatever that some deem as irrational or whatever. But the form and structure of many religions is actually quite coherent and congruent with some kind of type of reason. And among religious philosophers like Aquinas, religion is not, at least Christianity for Aquinas, is not adverse to rational thinking. You could get to rational thinking through revelation, and revelation was another method of understanding the world in a deeper way. So I don't like using the term religion with the presumption that it is an epithet to describe certain ideas.
Sure.
I think the better word may be zealous, because you can have a zeal for something that is not religious. Now, typically the word zeal is associated with religion or religious type setting, but you can have a zeal for something. You have a zeal for cars. You know this, Zigmund. So I think we ought to use better terminology, because I don't think religion is the right word to use, at least not in this context.
Yeah, and I get that. I just mentioned that William James, the founder of experimental psychology in the U.S., has noted that he defines religion as the feelings, acts, and experience of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. So I
Mm,
don't think William James,
mm,
for example, who is a great somebody who greatly appreciates religion himself, coming from a Protestant background to some degree, and is looking to reconcile religion and science in part, I think, in some of his pragmatic philosophy.
mm,
And he also states that religion is a
mm,
man's total reaction to life. So just using a more loose or pragmatic definition of what religion is, I think that we still can see that on the left. But I think you bring up a important point where you're saying, well, some people use that as an epithet. I think what people are really trying to suggest is that you have some folks in the left who are saying that they only believe in science, that they only follow the science,
mm.
and that they don't believe in God, or that they don't worship God, and therefore they're irreligious or atheistic people. And I think it's important to point out, well, maybe you aren't atheistic, and therefore perhaps it's not the case that putting Christianity down, for example, is a responsible thing to do when you guys still worship. You're just worshiping a different, you're worshiping an abstract idea instead of
Mhm.
a more traditional deity. That seems problematic, right?
And there are plenty of religions that worship abstract ideas. I mean, there are plenty of religions that even see God himself as an abstract idea. I mean, even amongst Christianity, there are plenty of denominations that worship abstract ideas.
Mm.
So but still, I suppose if we use James's definition, that moves the conversation to a different place
Mm.
because from what you've told me, James seems to be interested in how the individual interacts with religious ideas. Um, with this conversation here, or at least in that quote, I'm sure I'm sure he studied in group ideas in other settings, but in that quote at least. But when we say that leftism is a religion, or this sort of scientism is a religion, then I think we're implicitly saying that we are interested in how a particular political category of people interact with a certain category of idea, such as science or whatever. And really, I think that the terms "follow the science," which was a common refrain amongst many people on the left during COVID, I'm not sure that should be taken as a religious proclamation. Now, it was said so fervently and certainly that it might be taken as one. Of course, I can get how people would take it as one because that's all we heard. That was the common retort to any kind of skepticism to what the orthodoxy was saying, right? The orthodoxy said that cloth masks aren't necessarily effective. Then they went on and said that, well, maybe they are in this case. Now we realize that, regardless, masks really don't help all that much, and give or take. But and the retort to that during the entire pandemic was follow the science. That was more so of a vain appeal to ignorance than it was a confession of religious desire.
Mhm.
Now, again, there are people that would say that religion is a form of ignorance. There are people that would say that. I'm not necessarily addressing them right now. I'm
Sure.
trying to address that I don't think truly you can say follow the science or whatever is a religious proclamation.
No,
Um,
but
so
wouldn't it be the case though that if and I'm not criticizing religion in this piece. I'm just merely trying to highlight that if we take a definition of religion that appears to be justified through a well-renowned thinker like William James, that the left is just as religious has the right, and therefore instead of putting religion down, perhaps we can come to some kind of religious understanding instead of the left putting right-wing religion down when they're worshiping on their own. Perhaps they could learn to respect those people as rational individuals, right? Where I think a lot of people who are atheists or think that they're atheist, and as I try to debunk here, they're not. They put people who are religious down needlessly, right?
Some
And
atheists
and
do,
I think that
yes.
that causes needless, dishonest division by people who are a little bit conceptually confused, right?
Sure. I think in this case, though, it'd be more of a physician heal thyself moment.
Mm,
Because if someone proclaims the virtues of secularism and taking up the mantle of atheism, and then on the other hand is acting zealous towards a certain idea with something that looks like religious fervor, then perhaps they do need to reevaluate their own actions and beliefs. Perhaps that would benefit them in some way. But I mean, I'm not I'm not sure if I would call it. So I'll just, for the sake of the competition, I will
sure.
accept the idea that there is some sort of religious type of fervor organization on the left and the right. For the sake of competition, I'm skeptical of that premise, but I'll accept it. If that is the case, then the conversation really does go beyond the bounds of reason. It does go really to a more emotional type of dimension. And what I mean by that is, if there is a fervor that reflects religious zeal amongst the left, then obviously fervor is simply a child of passion, and passion deals with emotions. So it would follow to me that we may have to fight wars of passion and emotion to understand each other, rather than fighting battles of logic and reason and facts, as so many political thinkers want to, and me myself included, by the way. But I also recognize that there's a different dimension to human understanding that is emotional, that is full of the passions. And so this is part of the communication. You're going to have to figure out, if we accept this religious premise, how someone on the right, let's say a traditional Midwestern right-wing conservative, who follows the idea of family, faith, and tradition very closely, almost like a religion, right? For a second premise. You're going to have to figure out, how does that person communicate with a left-wing Vermont type vegan who wants to establish an egalitarian world, wants everyone to live in a commune where everyone's work is valued for their labor and not for anything else? How do you bridge that gap? Well, how do religions today bridge the gap between themselves? They have reconciliation conferences. They try to find similarities between each other. And the answer may be, instead of just saying, it's all religion, the answer may be, American pluralism. That may be the answer.
Yeah, no,
Unless,
and so I think you put us in a good place there. If there are more religious beliefs, and you accept that the premise has, I think that I think a utopia is a religious idea promoted by Marx. I think if you accept it, you do indeed have to have some conversation. But that's exactly what it is that I'm getting at, is that we're not even discussing the merits of different religious beliefs. The predominant cultural way is to just condemn Christianity as being an opiate of the masses, when, well, perhaps Marxism is the exact same way. And how would you adjudicate between those two things? Well, I think you could celebrate and appreciate a religion that leads to health, wealth, and greater success, and one that doesn't create resentment, division, fear. And I think of some left-wing religions, as I think communism clearly is, the ideological roots of CRT may be. I think that those things lead to resentment and ill health, right? And therefore people should, in some cases, choose Christianity. But that's what I'm suggesting here, is that we can't even have a level playing field because we can't agree that religion is so prevalent in society, right?
yes, this premise is not accepted by many people, of course. And as you pointed out dutifully, there are a lot of folks who are secularists who would definitely not accept this premise. So you're going to have to sell people on it, really, because this is the British understanding, right? You have to establish the foundation, and then the rest of the house can be built. Well, right now the foundation is not congruent to this, conducive, rather, excuse me, to this premise. The foundation on which we approach our conversations is not congruent to this premise. A lot of people like to see their beliefs as totally born from reason, fact, empiricism these days, unless they are more explicitly religious, like if they're more like spiritualist, New Age type folk, or folks that believe in sort of unseen phenomena which undergird the world. Which is someone like Jordan Peterson believes in, this sort of collective unconsciousness idea. And in that case, I think you'll have a better time establishing this foundation of recognizing religion as prevalent in a lot of our discourse. You'll have an easier time with a Jungian or someone like Peterson than you will an environmentalist who believes their desire to have a clean energy world is based entirely on empiricism and what they can see with pollution and things and consequentialism or what have you. So you're going to have to establish the foundation. You have to set the premise if you want to really get what you want to get, Zygmunt. The question is, is the premise going to be convincing to people? I don't know. I mean,
so I'm just merely trying to point out that the left, for example, does have various religious beliefs, and that therefore, if they can be honest about that and just candidly acknowledge that worshiping trees, for example, worshiping trees is not done on the basis of anything other than religion, then maybe they can come into a more honest conversation with other people who are just as religious as they are, but they don't worship trees or bugs. I mean, that's why you have things like trees rights activists, because people worship trees. They think that they have a common soul, and that's all right. That's a perfectly fine thing, but you really just have to be honest with yourself about that. And that's really what I'm trying to get at here, is that I think the left is using science as a guise. For example, this is what Marxism clearly does: is it uses science or scientism or some kind of economic chart that's made up by Marx and Hegel, and that's just a veneer of science that belies an underlying religion that Hegel clearly had, and that I think Marx himself inherited, and just instead of calling society the culmination of God, just said that society was going to come to a perfect utopia. So I think that's the case, and I think we need to find common ground in that regard. But before I get to our next story, I just want to mention here, if you are following along here in the chat, to go ahead and follow along with us at ZigmundReichenbach.com. You can go ahead and look at all the stories and be a interactive part of our conversation. And if you want to donate to continue our conversations between Christian and I, go to patreon.com/Zigmund E. Reichenbach. And I know Christian has a Patreon as well. So you can find Christian. He's the major Christian Watson out there, just by typing in his name. Next time, we'll make sure to have that in the chat for you guys. But the other point that I wanted to mention here, transitioning from this idea that you can have God without gods, or the religious equivalent of a God without gods, and worship abstract ideas like the coming of history, utopia, equality, fairness, so on and so forth, is the idea of a parallel society. And this was a term that came up to me in conversation, but it seemed to make sense for folks who are concerned about winning the so-called culture wars. I think perhaps instead of trying to win a culture war, we can opt out and create a more voluntary society. Let's see what the article says. The article says, for the last 100 plus years, philosophical Republicans have been chained to a progressive world vastly different from what the founders created. I probably should have said intended there, but is what it is. Instead of a republic, what we got was an administrative state led by an increasingly authoritarian presidents. So what I go on to suggest throughout the article is that instead of trying to combat these things, that we just set up a parallel society, reject public school, reject the government-run colleges, reject unions, and instead choose to create a voluntary society that better reflect our value. So what do you think, Christian? Do you think we should create a parallel society and opt out of these failing traditional institutions? Or do you think that we should cooperate with the big government takeover of our lives that's been going on for the last 100 years?
That might be a little bit of a false dichotomy there. I mean, there certainly are more options than just that, of course. But I understand where you're coming from, because look, The administrative state does rule resolute, unfortunately. I mean, almost every area of life is hindered by the administrative state. And that's going to just worsen with the infrastructure bill that was just passed and signed into law, which, continues the government's symbolic takeover of the very roads we travel on, the very ways we get to each other to connect with each other, and I've discussed that sort of symbolism in some of my other work. So I understand that it is concerning and it seems almost hopeless. But this question reminds me of the debate that occurred between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington actually explicitly advocated for Black folk to create their own society, worry about their businesses, cultivate excellence within themselves, focus on their communities, and not get involved in the political society. Whereas Du Bois was like, no, the political society is important because we exist within this. We have to reconcile some things. And so I've always liked to say that both perspectives are valuable. They are immensely valuable because on the one hand, you don't have a political society without having individuals, without having virtuous individuals. Let me rephrase that. You don't have a well-functioning and proper political society without having virtuous individuals. Locke distinguished between the government and between civil society in his chapter in the Second Views of Government on the Dissolution of Government. He distinguished between those two for a reason, because civil society is birthed from our interactions, or ideally it should be, or really, actually, in all actuality, it actually is birthed from our involuntary interactions. And the government is birthed from a desire to have those interactions preserved by some force larger than us. So the question becomes, in my opinion, there's a practical problem with this approach. The practical problem is this. Since the government is so inescapable, even creating communes that are in some far off distant part of the country, they're going to run into some kind of regulation, whether it's going to be environmental regulation, most likely if you're in a forest, or some kind of protected land. You'll run into some kind of regulatory apparatus on your way there. This is no excuse not to fight the regulatory apparatus. In fact, in other countries that have even worse regulations, there are certain people groups that have shown that they can fight regulatory apparatuses and maintain their land. Even though I disagree with their philosophies wholeheartedly, the Zapatistas in Mexico have showed, and in Mexico obviously has a much worse regulations than the United States, a much more perverse culture. Zapatistas have shown that if you fight and stand for your land, you can win. Now, the Zapatistas have guns, they are militants, and militant groups tend to be unfairly maligned in this country, so the conditions are different. But practically, there's no place you can go in America where you will not face government regulation, even the Burning Man.
No,
events.
But if people who love liberty and are individualist are thinking about, well, what is it should I do? Should I be trying to reform the big government structure?
I'm getting there. So, given that it is impractical to try to escape government regulation, even if you do from your own commune, then the reality is you have to confront it where it is. This is not to say preserve the status quo, but this is to say you have to work within the status quo. Institutions are simply manifestations of individual desires. Some institutions are manifestations that have stuck for a long time and have been preserved for a long time. But the moment an institution is inherited by someone that does not have the initial or proper vision of the institution in mind, the institution degrades. Now, since an institution is a tool, I believe institutions can be repaired, which is why I do believe it is important in some way, shape, or form to go ahead and fight for control of institutions. But it's also more important to make the primary institution in the country, which should not be the primary institution of the government, much less powerful, and which will lessen the sort of it will lessen the impact that would have on our cultural institutions. Because right now, a lot of our cultural institutions, universities, businesses and corporations, a lot of them are seated with some kind of government control. So the issue is not to try to reseize all the institutions, because you can have every single institution under control of someone who is individualist and still have the behemoth that is the government bothering us. The solution is to try to rein back governmental control, governmental influence over institutions, whether that is by repealing the child tax credit, which would be a wonderful idea, whether that is by scrapping the student loan program right now, which is a lot of colleges to inflate their prices, and has allowed government's desires to go into the classroom, regardless of what it is. There are many different ways that are pretty simple, although politically complicated, that can lessen the impact government has on cultural institutions. The question is not a matter of can it happen. The question is a matter of will. There's not the will to do it.
And so part of the reason why I asked this question is because professionally in my day job, I work as a grassroots organizer. In there, I'm seeing people have trouble in dealing with the fact that they are sending their kids to a government-controlled institution, and they're trying to reform it. In fact, a lot of these parents are acting like this is a big surprise, like, oh man, wow, this is so awful. How can any of this stuff go on? How can any of this CRT, DIE, so on and so forth, how can any of this be happening? And to me, it's like, well, this has been going on the whole time. This has been going on for at least 100 years. This is how the institution was designed. This is how it was set up. It was not set up to ensure that the individual flourishes. In fact, if you look at the works of John Dewey, which inspired these public schools, he doesn't talk about individual flourishing. He doesn't talk about people's well-being. No, what he wants to do is create a sense of commonality in which we can all sort of worship a mutual commonality that's done through children discovering their own capabilities and capacities with less traditional teacher influence. But it's like, why go through all that? Like, why not just create what I'm calling here a parallel society? Opt out. You don't have to send your kids to the government schools. You don't have to go to university. You don't have to sponsor these big government institutions. You can just say no altogether. Wouldn't that be a more effective approach than people banging their heads against the wall, screaming at school board members, and perhaps not getting as much done as they could if they were focused on perhaps a broader goal?
Well, the broader, so I think your question assumes that so let me backtrack. I think trying to reclaim and redirect the institutions in America is indeed a broader goal. It may not be a goal that people who want to have a sort of separationist kind of ideology where they go off with their families and take them out of society, kind of like how the Amish have always traditionally done. That may not be the goal that they prefer, but it's a broader goal nonetheless. I think that the essence of your question is that it is very difficult to deal with the institutions in society as they are right now. So why not just walk away? Well, we don't walk away because many reasons. Number one, these institutions have wide-ranging impacts. And no matter how much you don't want to deal with them, unfortunately, the coercive nature of the government is so as such that it will make you deal with it some way, shape, or form. You still have to have certain certifications if you want to have your kid homeschooled. You still have to go through hoops that are set up by the government in some way, shape, or form. So all you're doing is you're walking away from a problem that is going to fester and grow in the absence of luminous minds pushing back against it. So just for necessity, we shouldn't be running away from this. We live in a society, we certainly do. And in that society, there are certain things that are constants. Now, I do believe there are things you can do on an individual level that do not require you to go in and be an institutional juggernaut, right? You can, for example, grow your own food. If you have the capabilities to do that, that may be good. You don't have to go through government subsidized farms. Okay. You can educate your kids in certain school, but none of that should be an excuse to detach yourself from the very real political realities that are happening in the country right now. So, you can have this sort of pseudo alternative society that does not entirely embrace the idea, but goes about 50 to 60% of the way there, which provides you a foundation, a buffer, if only for morale, while still being a sort of warrior to reclaim the institutions.
Yeah. No, I just mentioned this because I do feel like in many ways a number of parents would be better off if they were able to partner with other people to do homeschooling or homeschooling co-ops, and it may save much more time and frustration instead of dealing with this government run school. And also, I mean, things like the university, it's not the case now in the university system that half of the people going actually get any use of those degrees. In fact, about half work jobs that do not require a college degree.
Yep.
So we can actually
Yep.
take back control just by walking away and just by being candid that, hey, our kids are becoming indoctrinated at a rate that's costly to them. It's stopping them from enjoying a life, stopping them from pursuing life, liberty, property, stopping them from owning homes, have kids. All that can be canceled. You can get rid of all those bad things just under voluntary choice. And so I was kind of saying that
In
has
that case, yes.
has an encouragement to people. Yes, you're never going to totally get away from government, but a lot of the things that are the source, the root of our problems, right? It's not that if you go to CRT schools and you say we're going to ban CRT, that's going to make the problem go away. All that comes from academia, where those things are nourished and developed and then pushed down to the
Right.
schools. We can defund that right now just by opting out. And so I hope more people will consider becoming
Sure.
a part of a parallel society that will do away with all the big government things that they don't approve of. The next story we have here that I wrote about, and actually I wrote this a couple years back and then rewrote it slightly, but I think it also touches on a important aspect of our culture that we should really be spending more time thinking about and focusing on. It's called marriage and liberty. And what I say in that is, by providing a solution to the political problem of being single, marriage saves Americans from government intrusion and uplifts humanity in the process. Likewise, as a symbol of indivisible commitment and financial success, marriage demonstrates that two citizens of voluntary union is more gratifying, profitable, and competent than big government and the big government's perpetual handouts. So I say that just to put us what we're currently dealing with in the United States. Right now, we actually are dealing with a marriage crisis. Heritage, for example, says that the lack of marriage cost us $100 billion per year. So that's an issue that's not even being talked about. We're forced to debate things that don't have any merit, like the Voting Rights Act that's going on in Congress, that's not going to pass, and people in Congress know it's not going to pass, but do so anyways. We're forced to, we let these institutions tell us that we have to focus on the president, and meanwhile, we're actually running into a real costly marriage crisis. Christian, what do you think we should do about the problem of this marriage crisis that we're dealing with? And do you think that marriage is one way to help defend liberty?
Let me answer the first question.
Yes, sir.
Actually, let me do the second question. The
Yep.
first question is way more complicated. The second question is complicated, but it can be addressed more concisely. So liberty is that power which I have over myself, which is reflected through my moral faculties, my rights, and which governments are compelled by virtue, by necessity, to respect. With that definition, that definition necessarily intersects with social things like friendships and marriages. So I have my liberty. It's a constant thing within me. It's endemic to my being. But how I use my liberty is bound by the principle of scarcity, as everything is. I have scarce energy. I have scarce time. And it follows that I have scarce uses of my liberty. Marriage, in some ways, provides me more opportunity to maximize my internal liberty. It provides me with more financial resources. Obviously, two incomes are going to be more than one, typically, in many cases. Actually, any case, really. It provides me with more stability, or at least the appearance of stability, because I mean, the divorce lawyer industry is quite profitable in America. We can talk about that sometime later. It provides me, at least as the facts would show, more stability for raising or marrying kids. So marriage provides me a lot of things that being single wouldn't necessarily provide. But marriage also provides restrictions as well. Now, liberty, of course, is not licensed, and so restrictions are actually endemic to having true liberty, right? Being bound by contracts is not necessarily an infringement upon your liberty if you agree to them, of course. But there are restrictions that could make someone feel as if they're not, what's the word for it? Could make someone feel as if they're not really able to enjoy their liberty as much as they want to. So my answer is, in some ways, marriage is absolutely a conduit for exercising your liberty. In other ways, it can feel like it's not. On balance, it depends on the marriage, in my opinion.
No, I think that's true. What I also try to point out here, though, is that there is something of a political problem of being single, and it has to be the case that either you're single with or without children. If you are single without children, you're creating the problem of a lack of human capital, where therefore America has to import human capital from elsewhere at a rate that is most definitely not free. Now, there are some upsides and advantages to doing so. Typically, immigrants to the United States are more likely to be entrepreneurs than people who have been here for a substantial number of generations. But nevertheless, there is indeed a demographic problem if you refuse to have children in that regard, or you are single with children. And in that case, that also creates another political problem for the child, where actually you're inviting the government into the child's life by lacking that parental stability and balance that a two-parent household provides. And therefore, that's going to lead to more coercive government action. I know this because I have, in a different life, I worked as a substitute teacher in special education. And it was probably the case that in many of those households, that a lot of those kids had single parents, and that's not saying anything about them, but the government was apparently much more involved in their lives than what it was in other people at a much greater, higher cost. So I would think that marriage would help protect the family, or forgive me, protect individuals from state encroachment, right?
You would think. Even
No,
though
I mean, of course, divorce is indeed likely to happen. Or
and even though, unfortunately, marriage is most certainly right now a government-managed institution. People may see it primarily as a cultural institution. Sure, great. That might be true, but it is 100% manned by the government, cultural or not. So the state's coercive power is still there. Now, it may work for the benefit of the two people, I guess, who are in the relationship, as long as they don't get divorced. If that happens, and then if there's no prenuptial agreement, then alimony will. Anyway, so point is, the government's coercive power is still in marriage, but in different ways. Obviously, welfare and things are more likely if you have a poor single mother. If you have a single mother who works all the time, like mine did, then maybe that's not the problem there. But there are other issues with the single parenthood thing, I think. More emotional issues. And whereas where welfare is not concerned, there's the emotional issues. There's all kind of things that come with that kind of stuff. So, but I do think on balance, marriage does provide less of an opportunity cost. if the kids have to go out somewhere and you're a single parent, you have to take them or have to get someone else to take them. If you're together, your partner can take them if they're able to. There's less of an opportunity cost, but gives you more ability to exercise your internal liberty. So I would say on balance, yeah, maybe marriage is a conduit for liberty. But I also, I don't, when you say that being single being single with no kids is a political problem, I don't know. It's
and
perhaps it
so
is.
so
I mean,
let's be
in
clear.
Japan, in Japan, it certainly is. But there are some who would take that argument, like the post-liberals, and say, okay, because this is a political problem, you need to have kids. So we're going to subsidize you having kids. Now, you're not saying that at all. You're just pointing out something that, but I don't think someone deciding to be single is necessarily a political problem. Now, maybe if it happens enough in succession and no one gets married and no one has kids, obviously you're going to have a population shortage like Japan. And you're going to have robots running everything. So yes, that is a political problem.
Yeah, and that's really what I'm trying to open up the consideration of, and actually to get people to think more thoughtfully about, because I think you have people say, well, we need to wage war for liberty, we need to seal up the border for liberty, we need to do this and that for liberty. It's like, one simple thing that you could do for liberty is encourage people to get married and to live a responsible marriage and to have a responsible life for their children, so their children grow up in a healthy, safe environment that precludes government involvement. I'm not saying you should subsidize that. I think people should do things voluntarily, but I don't think that if people aren't advocating for marriage seriously, that I don't think anybody is going to have a reason to think that that is a great thing. I know personally, when I was younger, I thought marriage was something that was problematic and in a lot of ways a danger to kids who see fighting parents and so on and so forth. But what I didn't consider at the time was the trade-off or the alternative of single parenting, and how it's just so dangerous after being around so many people or kids even that probably come from single parent households. I saw the danger up front. I just wish that people, instead of thinking of marriage as a patriarchal institution that's designed to oppress and keep women or men or whomever down, they should look at it as a safeguard for liberty, or a safe investment, a safe way of protecting liberty. Right.
Yeah. And we're presuming the marriages are healthy, obviously, because I would rather a kid have a single parent than to have two abusive parents or one abusive parent.
Right.
And I don't want, I understand that there are going to be economic difficulties and emotional difficulties and social difficulties if you have one parent, but if you have an abusive mother or abusive father and abusive father, in most cases, or an abusive mother in rare cases, then I would much rather they be single, because at least they'll be away from that kind of emotional pressure, right? And the institution of marriage itself is no guarantee for virtue, and that's a problem that I know you're not saying that, but that's a problem that a lot of traditionalists make. They assume that marriage is congruent with virtue. It is not. It is not at all, especially with how marriage has become so commodified recently. So you can have people that are married who don't really even respect or know what that means. So this is going to require a revolution of the heart for marriage to really fulfill its proper functions in most cases.
No, that's right.
But,
go ahead.
Yeah. But no, so but there's also the mistake of thinking, well, because marriage is also a restriction too. Marriage restricts you from doing a lot of things. Obviously, if you're in a monogamous relationship, obviously you cannot go out and have sex with someone else. Most monogamous relationships don't do that by definition. By definition, now there are a lot of polyamorous marriages these days.
Yeah.
So, which is a part of the degradation I was talking about of marriage, people not even knowing what marriage. Because in my opinion, true marriage is going to be two people, right?
Yeah. No, right.
That's just my opinion. But like, how would you the issue of gay couples who may not be able to produce seed children rather, how would you account for them in terms of the
Well,
political capital issue, the human capital
even
issue?
then, I mean, the truth is that the studies show that that's actually better for their own well-being too, where really just marriage between anybody, two people, is a protective for individuals' well-being. So if you're thinking about, well, how am I going to protect my own liberty? Well, one maybe part of that equation would be to get married, because otherwise you probably will subject yourself to risky behavior that's costly. So if you're single, odds are there's a chance that you're either going to be sitting home alone, depressed, which is a problem and that it has its cost, or you're going to be going out to the bar and probably drinking too much and getting affiliated with the wrong people, which also creates a political problem. Marriage is a prophylactic against the damages that we do to ourselves when we're by ourselves, almost universally across the board. And there certainly can be some shortcomings to that, but even marriage, just for anybody in a two couple relationship, is going to help them protect their liberty by placing that restraint on them, because humans without restraint aren't capable of producing an enduring society. It's just
What
not
about
feasible.
self-restraint?
You can do that to some degree, but you're not. There are fundamental human needs that, and one of them being companionship, that the lack of that will cause
Oh,
damage
I
that
agree.
over
Oh, I agree.
time
I
will
agree.
restrict
I
liberty.
agree. No, I absolutely I agree with that, but I think we're adding too much value to marriage itself. Oh, well, marriage can make it less likely for you to go out in the bar and get associated with drug dealers, or marriage can do. Okay, if you were going to do those things before you got married, then there's something, and the fact that you got married doesn't necessarily change your desire to do those things. It may change you actually going out and doing those things because you have restrictions. But if you still have the desire in your heart for that kind of behavior, your passions are not correctly subdued.
True.
Continence. This is the point that the ancient Greeks and the natural law philosophers wanted to point out very, very astutely. Continence is so important for the preservation and the continuation of not only human life itself, but a good human life, a flourishing human life. You have to be able to subdue your passions. So if you haven't gotten that fixed, this is why there's a lot of emotionally immature people getting married and then blowing up at their partners, having fights, having divorces, because something in them wasn't fixed first.
Oh, sure.
So that's why I say self-mastery, not so you can be a atomistic person out there existing by yourself. No. But so you can be someone who is strong enough and stable enough to carry a commitment like marriage on your back.
Sure.
And not falter.
No, that's right. So yeah, that's a point that I agree with. I guess the bottom line for this, but before we move on here, is I'll say that if we were placing bets on what would be most likely to protect individual liberty and safeguard against the state, that marriage would be one of the safer bets that you could wager on, insofar as you're prepared to do so. And I think people need to think more thoughtfully about that particular subject and be able to have an honest conversation with their kids and other people about the virtues of marriage. Growing up, my parents didn't have that conversation with me, and that's not their fault. They don't aspire to be philosophers or to study philosophy. But if more parents were telling their kids, listen, one reason why you get married is not only to protect yourself and the person you're marrying, but to protect the future generations from the ward of the state, then maybe that would make more sense to people. So just trying to go ahead and reframe the narrative, if you will. The last thing we talked about this week was progressives and false progress. And one of the reasons why I discussed this is because it just seemed like the narrative, or this idea that progressives really support progress, is just unfounded, particularly if you look at the philosophical history of what's going on. in that in the 1920s, academics and elites did finally recognize that humanity was progressing. But when they came to understand that, they thought, because of the statist philosophy that they inherited from a German philosophy professor, that progress was the ever encroachment and expansion of the administrative state. And so for them, really what progress meant is advancing bureaucracy's interest over the true source of progress, which is capitalism. And the reason why capitalism is really progressive is because it advances humans' fundamental interest, which is basically just getting more stuff, different stuff, and new stuff to allow them to perform an ever expanding number of different things. So, in short, capitalism is progressive because it gives humans more and more of what they want, which is abundance and difference. And I think that that was really overlooked in history, is that these people weren't progressives, but they were actually collectives. They were collectivists. They supported the collective impoverishment movement, where we are going to collectively impoverish people by advancing the interests of the state. Christian, what do you think of that analysis? And do you think it is the case that progressives ought to be called progressives, or then maybe a better moniker for them would be collectives?
Yeah. Wordplay is interesting in politics because a lot of people are so many different things, right? You got people who are personal conservatives, but who are fiscally liberal. You got people who are fiscally conservative, but who are personally liberal. You got people who are progressive, but their actions seem to be quite to be taking humanity back to a time that we don't want to go into the darkness. It's just interesting. So I think that when you use the word progressive in any meaningful sense of the word, you're going to have this idea of capitalism. You're going to have this idea of humanity being unleashed from change, because when we're unleashed from change is when we can really flourish. Not when we're unleashed from duty or restraint. I'm not saying that. When we're unleashed from morally illegitimate chains, we can best flourish. The progressivism of the political sword is a sort of inversion of the word. It wants to progress you, but it wants to progress you by putting chains on you. And those chains are not meant to necessarily simply bind you, but they're meant to also direct you. Now, the idea of a chain being able to direct you to anything is very interesting. Perhaps it draws up an image of a dog being led by a leash, chained to a leash. That's what it does for me. But progressives want to use force, which are the metaphorical chains here, to progress you to certain ends that may not have anything to do with human flourishing and have everything to do with the utopic view of the world. This is the entire basis of the environmentalism movement, whether it was Teddy Roosevelt, I think it was him who created national parks, whether it was Wilson and his initiatives, whether it was FDR and his roving New Deal, whether it was LBJ and the Great Society, which promised to alleviate poverty and still left millions in poverty, almost as if scarcity is actually a thing that exists and poverty is bigger than simply a dollar amount, maybe. And maybe that's a radical thought to consider. These are acts of bondage which are meant to promote growth. So I think, when they're called regressives by people, that has a lot of truth to it. There's a lot of truth to it, because until you can realize that force does not promote growth, force is a negation of growth. Until you can realize that, then you're on philosophically slippery ground. So yeah, I mean, now calling them collectives, though, I don't mean collectivist, yeah, but I'm not sure how useful that is, because there's a lot of place.
So here's what I'm trying to say, right? In this article, I am trying to make the case that if we are fighting for the moniker of progress, that it certainly does not belong to the left, that they are better thought of as collectives, in the sense that they believed in collectivism. They believed in the power of the state, and therefore, in terms of having philosophically accurate dialogue between different people, we have to make we have to use terms that represent reality. Where for the last 100 plus years, they've been able to use this term progressive. That has given them a rhetorical advantage. We are on the right side of history. You'll hear every Democrat say, we're on the right side of it. Well, what they don't understand is they got that from Hegel, okay, but back in the 1920s, and they're associating progress with this philosophical chart that Hegel came up with to say that, us statists are at the top of the chart, we're progress, when in reality what was going on was capitalism was revolutionizing and changing the world. It wasn't the coercive power of the state, and that there was a deep error, deep philosophical error made in people who were using that moniker, because only capitalism provides humans with what they fundamentally want, which is abundance, indifference. The state does not provide that, and the state can't provide that, right?
Right. So that's what I was trying to do a few moments ago. I was trying to draw a distinction between progressivism in the truest sense of the word and progressivism in terms of the political inversion of the word, right? Because again, words can have distinction, can have the same name with distinct meanings. Linguistics can work like that, as you very well know. So I think that is still very important to identify, because the progressive ideas do, at least in terms of them existing, do conform to a sort of reality. There are progressives that believe that you can progress human beings on a philosophical level through change. That is an idea that conforms to, well, the merits of the idea don't conform to reality, but the existence of the idea certainly does conform to reality, because we have so many examples of it. Even around us today, we have so many examples of it. So I think, even beyond understanding the origins of the word, it's important to understand what the word implies, right? Because we're trying to draw a distinction between true progressivism and sort of inverted progressivism, right? Because the inverted cross, is an insult to Christianity, but it's still an inverted cross. So, and the inverted progressivism is an insult to really what true progress looks like, but it still bears the moniker progressivism, and that's the grounds we should fight it on.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, and further, part of the reason why I'm trying to draw out this distinction is because I think that words subtly influence people's behaviors and beliefs that they may not be aware of. So to take a analogous example, we'll take the use of the term democracy. People say that the United States say democracy. Well, it isn't, and it never has been, but because people think that, then they equate Democrats with what the founders originally wanted. And therefore they say, well, I have to vote for these guys because they are what the founders really, truly believed. And it's like, well, no, that's all wrong. And the same is true for the term progressivism, where people think, oh, I'm going to be hip and young and cool, I'm going to be a progressive. Well, you're just confused. You're relying on Hegel's definition of what progress was, or what Marx's definition of progress was, but none of those things brought out true progress, which is abundance and difference. Only capitalism creates the conditions for those things to flourish. And so hopefully people can understand that in a way that allow them to rethink how they think about politics, because I think that many progressives are just confused, and if they better understood the distinction and difference between these words, maybe they would be able to make better choices at the polling place, right?
I think when you accept inverted definitions and you are committed to those ideas, being told your definition is not correct, probably, or that it comes from Hegel, who most folks haven't heard of, probably won't change minds. Now, that's no reason not to say it. Of course you say it. You shout it at the rooftops, obviously. The truth is not a really popular commodity, but it's a necessary commodity, right? Because we live in a reality that is formed by objective laws and rules. But we live in an era of standpoint epistemology, where what you believe, your experience, overrules anything else. And so accepting that, understanding that's going to allow us to make the most politically effective, or rhetorically effective rather, pitches to people who are concerned with these false ideas or inversions of terms.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Well, looks like we are out of time here for our Sunday show. If you're listening, make sure to follow. You can follow at Reichenbach.com to subscribe to the newsletter to stay up to date on the discussion. Likewise, you can go to patreon.com/Zigmund Reichenbach to make a contribution to this. And hopefully one day we will be able to recoup the operating costs of putting this show out there. But I think it's substantial and important. And Christian, go ahead and plug your credentials or
Oh
where they
yeah,
can find more of what you do at.
yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram at official C Watson. You can also find me on YouTube. But my channel's name is Christian Watson. I'm going to start doing videos again later this week once I get everything set up. So yeah, I'm happy to have been here.
That's all we have for the Zigmund Reichenbach Show featuring Christian Watson. We will be back next week at the same time, same place with topics I have not thought of yet. But when I do think of them, you will be the first to get them if you subscribe to ZigmundReichenbach.com. That's the best way to stay engaged with what's going on philosophically, politically, and culturally. It's the only site that exists at the intersection of those things and really tries to get at the root of the problem instead of beating around the bush or saying a bunch of crazy nonsense that doesn't impact your life, like what people in Congress do or what the media allows you to hear. Well, until next time, we'll see.